Okay, shalom. We're going to look at an interesting sugyah today. It's the sugyah of when you have contradictory times in halacha, when it could be Shabbos and not Shabbos at the same time, and you have to say something in benching. So it's a complicated sugyah, but it's a really good one. So I think that we're going to enjoy this one. Okay, so let's start. This is the introductory shiur. So this is just going to be us looking at the sources and then the questions. And then when we have shiur on Sunday, with God's help, we'll start answering some of the questions. Okay, so the first source is here in the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch says as follows: Shabbos Omer Ba Ritzevach Litzenu. So we're talking about benching on Shabbos. We say Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, and we say that on Shabbos you say Ritzevach Litzenu. You mention Shabbos. Rosh Chodesh v'Yom Tov v'chol shel moed omer yalav yavo. And on Shabbos and on Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov and on Chol Moed we say yalav yavo. We add these special prayers into benching. V'imchal echad mehem b'Shabbos, and if one of them falls on Shabbos, omer ritzevach litzenu. Right. So you say if Rosh Chodesh or Yom Tov or Chol Moed falls on Shabbos, then we say also ritzei and everything else. Okay. V'achar kach yalav yavo. Right. You say ritzei and then yalav yavo. Ve'eno maskir shel Shabbos. We don't mention Shabbos inside Yalav Yavo. That's like a different sugyah, different machlokas. V'lo shel Yom Tov v'chol shel moed Rosh Chodesh b'ritzevach litzenu. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch then says Omer al Hanisim. We say al Hanisim b'berachas hamazon. This is on Purim and Chanukah, right? We say al Hanisim b'berachas hamazon b'berachas haaretz, right? Okay, so we mentioned al Hanisim on Chanukah and Purim. We talk about the day there as well. We're going to see this later. This is going to be a thing that if our meal starts on Purim day and goes all the way till night when it's no longer Purim, right? Omer al Nisim, and you say al Nisim to basar tchilas sudas, because when we bench, we go by what we were doing in the beginning of the meal. Again, this is going to be our question. And those that say they don't, and we hold that we say the first thing. Okay, so this is going to be our real essential question, that if I start a meal on one day and the meal extends after that day has concluded, and there was that day was Shabbos, Purim, Yom Tov, and I was supposed to mention something during that day, what do I do now when it's no longer the day? Do I mention the day as well? Okay, so let's look at the Beis Yosef. We're going to see three different parts to the Beis Yosef, and it's going to, Beis Yosef is going to mention a debate that we have here. Okay, so the Beis Yosef says as follows: So let's say it's Shabbos afternoon, early Shabbos like we have today. It doesn't have to be an early Shabbos, but let's say it's an early Shabbos, and it's close to dark when I start my meal. Now you should know you can't really start a meal after sunset, but let's imagine I start my meal a little before sunset. The chashchalo called him Gemar Sudasa, and it gets dark before I finish my meal. My meal extended past when it got dark. Kasav Rosh b'tshuva klachaf base. So the Rosh says, and this is the first opinion we're going to see. Let's keep in mind it's the Rosh. She'ein lo lahaskir klal shel Shabbos b'chol. Right. So we never mention Shabbos and chol. So if my meal extended and now it's time for me to bench and it's already 3 stars came out, clearly Shabbos has ended. The Rosh holds we don't mention Shabbos because we never mention Shabbos when it's a weekday. And now that the meal has gone past Shabbos, it's a weekday. Okay, so as a proof, he brings up the case where let's imagine I missed Mincha on Shabbos. I totally forgot about Mincha on Shabbos. It wasn't my fault, but I forgot about Mincha on Shabbos. I was prevented from davening Mincha on Shabbos. So what do? So I make it up at Mariv. Now, the second Shmon Esrei that I'm going to say at Mariv is my makeup Shmon Esrei. And since that's a Shabbos makeup, right, I'm making up for something on Shabbos, I would imagine that at this point, that what should I do? I imagine at this point that my second Shmon Esrei should be of Shabbos, but it's not. I daven Mariv twice. So since I daven Mariv twice, Mariv of Motzei Shabbos twice, says the Rosh, why do I do that? Because I can never mention Shabbos on a weekday. And since it's a weekday, it's too late now, so I can't go ahead and do that. Okay, and that's his proof that we never mention a weekday Never mention Shabbos on a weekday. So if my meal on Shabbos extended to multi-Shabbos, I cannot go ahead and mention Shabbos in benching anymore because it's a weekday and I don't mention Shabbos on a weekday. Okay. Right? If a group of people were eating together, and it becomes Shabbos, right? I'm eating on Friday night. The Kamar Rabbi Yossi, Gamar Sudasa Kos Rishon, Omrim Allah Berachas HaMazon, Betosefta the Brachos, Shona B'divrei Rabbi Yossi, and Masker Shashavs Berachas HaMazon, Afagav the Sudas Chol Haisa, Keva the Mevarach B'Shabbos, Tzarech HaHasker Shal Shabbos, Achinami Afagav the Sudas Shabbos Haisa, Keva the Mevarach B'Chol Lo Yasker Shal Shabbos Akal Shalom. The Rosh says the exact opposite is true. That I never mention Chol on Shabbos. So if let's say I'm eating Friday afternoon and it becomes dark and it becomes Shabbos, right? So then I stop my meal in the middle, I make Kiddush, I continue my meal, and now it becomes a Shabbos meal. When I bench, I say it's Shabbos. Why? Because when it's Shabbos, I mention Shabbos. When it's Chol, I mention Chol. No matter what, it has nothing to do with the meal itself. It has with the time of day. It doesn't have to do with what kind of meal this is. It has to do with what time of day it is. Okay. V'chein kasav Rabbeinu b'simen tafresh sadik. Hey, agabe Purim shem hischil sudas l'biyom mashchat alayla kasav avi. Right. So he says hashein lo omrim al nisim. Right. So the same thing is true. He says, let's say it's Purim, and I start my meal on Purim, and it was Purim the afternoon when I started my meal, but the Suda got so great, they kept on going, and by the time I finish, it's already past Purim. So now, says the Rosh, since we never will mention the special day on a non-special day, meaning the Purim, the uniqueness of the day of Purim, I don't mention that when it's not Purim. So too, just like on Shabbos, I don't mention Shabbos in benching when it's Motzi Shabbos. If it's Motzi Purim, if it's after Purim, I don't mention Purim. That is the opinion of the Rosh. Okay, so going on in the Beis Yosef, the Beis Yosef says as follows. This is source number 4. The Beis Yosef says, Aval Gos Maimon, right? So in the Gos Maimonios, he says something different. Kasav v'shem Rambam shetzarach levarach al hanisim k'nei eshkechan rov tzalei sheshavos l'motzi shavos akadu matzasi kasav v'tshuva ashkenazis t'svarzu lo tishkei v'tfilos mincha de Shabbos the Ma'aseh Rosh b'zman tfilos mincha avar v'eino mispal motzi shavos. And he says the exact opposite. He says no. He says that if the meal goes on, you mention the day that you that the meal, like the nature of the meal. In other words, if it was a Purim meal, you mentioned Purim. And he says that proof that the Rosh gave that that if I forgot mincha and on Motzi Shabbos I'm davening tashlumim, I'm davening a makeup mincha. So that right. So he says that that mincha that I don't mention, that has nothing to do with the fact that whether it's Shabbos or not Shabbos, right? Why don't I mention? Why do I daven a chol? Because it's not Shabbos anymore. So since it's not Shabbos, I can't daven a Shabbos Shmona Esrei because the time for mincha has passed. Since the time of mincha has passed, ve'eno mispal motzi Shabbos el tashlumim hechispal shel Shabbos. If the time of Shabbos has passed, how can I daven a Shabbos Shmona Esrei when it's no longer Shabbos, right? So v'dino lahavdil barishona. Right, so there I have to make Havdalah, but that has nothing to do with benching. That's a whole different thing. It's because I can't daven a mincha shmona esrei at night. That's why I don't mention Shabbos. But what he says when it comes to benching, asay al suda shesad b'Shabbos, became a dakase lotzale arvish shachol tzarech lasker meina ma'ora b'berachas hamazon. But when it comes to benching, I have to mention the nature of the meal was. This is different than when it comes to davening my Shemona Esrei. Benching and Shemona Esrei have nothing to do with each other, and the Rosh should never have brought it in as a proof. This is what the Gos Maimonios is saying. It says v'chein minag pasha b'medinos b'nei Rabbeinu Tam, I guess lahaskir nisim b'chol gavna v'chein motzi shabbosos k'shenim shechal sudas and alaylas. He says, and in our custom, he says, is not like what the Rosh says, that if the meal extends, that we do mention the whatever day it was when we started the meal. So if I start my meal on Shabbos and extends to Motzi Shabbos, he says that I do go ahead and mention Shabbos, even though it is Motzi Shabbos. I do mention Shabbos by benching. So he says, going on, this is source number 5 here. Okay, so he says, Archos Chaim, V'zel Shono, right? So he says, Haya ocha v'yotze Shabbos, I'm eating, and it gets to Motzi Shabbos, right? I'm eating my Shabbos meal, and it turns Motzi Shabbos. So it's also Shemashke Shel Shabbos Berachos Mazon. We do mention Shabbos. We say Ritzei, even though Shabbos is clearly ended a long time ago. Shakol holech achar chalas hasuda, because our rule, says Tosfos, and again, this is different than the Rosh, is that we follow the beginning of the meal. We follow the beginning of the meal. And that's the halacha when it comes to Rosh Chodesh and Purim. Okay, so that's the he says we always go by the beginning. So we have a debate between the Rosh and Tosfos, and this is our question about whether or not, when it's no longer the day, do we mention the previous day by which we started the meal? That's our question. So that's the debate between Tosfos and Rosh, and our question is how we're going to explain that debate. Okay, let's see. This is the Shulchan Aruch here. The Shulchan Aruch says as follows: Haya ochel v'yaseh Shabbos. Let's say I eat and I'm eating, right? Here's the Shulchan Aruch, right? So I'm eating and Shabbos goes out. The Shabbos ends. Maskir shel Shabbos v'berachos hamazon. So I mention Shabbos in my benching. Okay, that's linan basar aschas asuda. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins like Tosfos. He doesn't know like the Rosh. He says that we mention Shabbos in our benching, right? Rosh Chodesh or Purim and Chanukah. And the same thing would be true if I started a meal on Rosh Chodesh or Purim and Chanukah, and the meal extended past Motzei Shabbos. Okay, so that's what he says. So now the Mishnah Berurah says that's linam. But this is source number 7 here. So why is this true that we go by the beginning of the meal? So he says because once I started the meal on Shabbos, on Rosh Chodesh, on Purim, on Chanukah, whatever it is, I have to mention that day inside my meal. Even if it gets very late at night, Shabbos is over hours ago, Rosh Chodesh ended hours ago, it doesn't make a difference. The Mispal Marav called him Berachos HaMazon Shuveino Masker, but he does say that if you did daven Marav your meal went so long, you decide to daven Marav in the middle of the meal, Shuveino Masker Shashas Berachos HaMazon. Right, so he says then at that point, okay, then you don't mention Shabbos. In other words, on a regular thing, let's say Shabbos ends at 6 o'clock. I started my Shabbos at 5 o'clock. And Shabbos went till 7 o'clock, right? Shabbos ended an hour ago. So then I mention Shabbos because I go by the beginning of the meal. But let's say at 6:30, I decide to daven Marav. So I daven Marav, and now in Marav, I said Abdullah in Marav, it was a chol Marav, it was a full weekday shmones, right? So now I come back to the table. I can't say Ritzei in my benching. I can't say Shabbos. I just said Havdalah. That, says the Mishnah Berurah here, Mechzei K'stari Hadari, right? Hadari, right? That's what's called a Tasei Desasri. I can't go ahead and say Havdalah in my shmones and then come back to the table and say Ritzei. That's too much of a contradiction. Right? So that's our second question now. What does this mean? It's too much of a contradiction, right? What does it mean that I have to mention, I can't mention Shabbos? Why can't I have this contradiction? Why can't I go ahead and daven Marav and say Havdalah and then come back to the table and say Ritzei? What's the problem? Okay, so it's a contradiction. A big deal. So what's the issue with that contradiction? That's our second question. Okay. The Mishnah Berurah goes on, and he talks about the following. Let's see what he says as follows. Basar Eschas, he says, go after the beginning of the meal. Lefichach afim chal Rosh Chodesh b'motzei Shabbos. Now let's imagine this is a great case. Okay, it's Shabbos, and Motzei Shabbos is Rosh Chodesh. So Shabbos is the last day of the month. The next day, Rosh Chodesh is the first day of the month. Okay, and now I sit down late in the day on Shabbos, and I have a meal, and it extends to Motzei Shabbos. Now it's Rosh Chodesh. So now I have to say, if it's Rosh Chodesh, I have to say Yalav Yavo. Oh, but my meal has to say Ritzei. It's not going to say, if I say Ritzei and Yalav Yavo, it's 2 different calendar dates. How does that make sense? He says, L'fichach af imcha Rosh Chodesh b'Motzei Shabbos. So if Rosh Chodesh falls on Motzei Shabbos, Yazkir b'Berachos HaMazon shel Shabbos levad. Then I only say Ritzei in my benching, the low shel Rosh Chodesh, and I don't say Yalav Yavo Rosh Chodesh, even though I'm actually sitting down and eating on Rosh Chodesh. When I eat, it is Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so that doesn't work. But that's Listen carefully. Says Mishabur, he qualifies it. He says that's only if you actually finished eating. And it's not the meal. You finished eating when it was still Shabbos. You didn't eat anything. You never actually put anything. You sang at the Torah, but you didn't actually eat anything. Okay, at night. It says Aval im achal paskan balayla. But if you did eat bread at night, then you have to mention Rosh Chodesh also. So now you're going to end up saying in benching, right? It's an insane scenario. You're going to sit in benching and you're going to say Ritzei, which was yesterday, Shabbos, and you're going to say Yalav Yavo, which is today because it's Rosh Chodesh, right? But how could you do that? That's a contradiction, like we just had before, right? How can I say on this day of Shabbos and this day of Rosh Chodesh? They're not on the same day. They fall on 2 different days. Right, I said the Rosh Chodesh b'yom aleph. Right, im kain. So what do we do? Mutav v'hasker shel Rosh Chodesh. It's better to mention Rosh Chodesh on Motzei Shabbos. Right, and again, this is this case where I ate both on Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh in one meal. So then it says it's better to mention Rosh Chodesh. Because there's an obligation to mention Rosh Chodesh and not an obligation to mention Shabbos. Okay, right? So that's a strange thing. Right? We have a whole debate about whether or not we should mention Shabbos at all on Motzei Shabbos, right? The Rosh would say you shouldn't mention Shabbos. So according to the Rosh, it's pashut, simple, that I only mention Rosh Chodesh and I don't mention Shabbos in this case, right? Even though we assume that we hold, right? The Shulchan Aruch holds they go by the beginning of the meal, which seems to argue that I should say Ritzei and not V'yalav Yavo. Chayav Hasker Shel Shabbos Motzei Shabbos Kol Makom Kanshu Makom Hatchak Mutav Shitches Gas Shabbos. So here, since it's this weird case, it's best, he says, not to mention Shabbos and only Rosh Chodesh. Okay, Achein, he says, right? So this is source number 9. Achein b'Motzei Shabbos be'Upurim afilim Gamar Sudaso Balayla, right? So let's say it's Shabbos and Purim. Okay, yeah, it's Shabbos and Motzei Shabbos turns into Chanukah or Purim. Okay, so Chanukah Purim fall out on Sunday, and Shabbos is Erev Chanukah or Erev Purim, whatever. Afilim Gamar Sudasa Balayla. Even if I finish my meal at night, Eino Masker Shel Chanukah Purim. So, okay, so before I dive in and before I hear Megillah, before I light my Chanukah candles, my meal goes late. And now, should I mention Chanukah Purim now? Right? It says that for sure you don't. Rak Shel Shabbos. Then you only mention Shabbos. Okay, because there I don't have a chiyuv to mention Chanukah Purim. Different than Rosh Chodesh and different than Shabbos. There's no real obligation to mention Chanukah Purim. It's just something that we add in, but it's not an obligation. The Al Nisim is not obligatory, as is Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so that's a strange thing, right? Strange thing. Okay, so right, so those are, so now how can you, right? So that's our question. Our last question here is, how could you mention Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos simultaneously, like we said in the last one? So we have 3 basic questions here. 3 questions. First question is, how do we explain the debate between the Rosh and Tosfos about whether you mention Shabbos when the meal extends to Motzei Shabbos? Our second question is, how do we understand the conceptual reason that we don't mention Purim and Chanukah, even though, right, when the meal extends to Motzei Shabbos, which is Purim and Chanukah, even though we do say Rosh Chodesh? Again, technically, we understand the technical reason, conceptual reason. And lastly, how can you mention both Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh simultaneously? Okay, those are our questions. That's our shiur. And with God's help, we should have shiur on Sunday. See you then.